I mean, look, Bible translations, which ones would you recommend and why?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and it's a question I have to really tread lightly. And by the way, the verse I want to recommend to people, Proverbs 18:17, should be one of the verses you etch in your hearts, your minds, and write it on the walls. Proverbs 18:17 says, the first to present his case seems right until his neighbor comes and questions him. Right? So anyone can make a powerful, persuasive case if you just leave them alone. But when you bring others to start asking the right set of questions, his case might not be as strong. The only time someone should be convinced of something is if it stands the harshest, the toughest objections biblically. That's why, no doubt, Trinity is absolutely true. It's irrefutable. Jesus being the God-man, absolutely true, irrefutable. That the Bible is divine in origin, absolutely true, it's irrefutable. Because it stands the toughest objections and decimates them. So glory to the triune God for that. But I want your audience to remember Proverbs 18:17. The first to present his case seems right until someone comes and questions him. Make that your life verse. And then 1 Thessalonians 5:21, which goes with it. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things. Hold fast to that which is good. It's right there. Now, as far as Bible translation is concerned, for the most part, any English translation that's done by a committee of Trinitarian scholars will give you a faithful reproduction of God's word in English, because the manuscripts that have been preserved by God, we have nearly over 25,000, close to 30,000 manuscript copies of the different books of the Bible in various languages. Some go even before Christ in the case of the Old Testament, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have copies of the Hebrew Old Testament books, with the exception of Esther. They haven't found that yet. That were uncovered in 1947. That were written anywhere from 200 to 100 years before Christ. Now, as far as the New Testament, that comes after Christ, we have copies of the New Testament from the 2nd century, and then copious citations of the Church Fathers from the 2nd century and none. So the Bible books are in a class all their own. The amount of manuscript and textual historical evidence for its preservation is overwhelming. Nothing even comes close to it. When I'm talking about nothing, I'm talking about books of antiquity or even medieval period prior to the printing press. Even skeptics, someone like a Bart Ehrman, will tell you the manuscripts of the Bible are ginormous. There's no other book that has as much manuscript. And if you're going to question its accurate preservation, throw out all the books of antiquity and the medieval period down the drain, because they don't even come close. So as far as the preservation of God's words, they're there, preserved. Nothing's lost. The problem is that you have certain manuscripts that were discovered in the 19th, 20th centuries that are from 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. So these are probably our oldest witnesses to the books of the Bible. The problem there is that though they are early, they have a higher degree of disagreement. Now, I have to be careful when I say disagreement. They're going to think that means, oh, it changes the message. No, it doesn't. This is a statement of fact. You pick up a copy of the Gospel of John written in the 2nd century, and you pick up a copy of the Gospel of John written in the 9th century, 800s. You're going to get the same theology, the same meaning, the same Jesus. You're not going to get a different theology. But there are differences because copyists do not copy the same way, and they don't make the same mistakes. So then how do we know that the original is preserved? Because if you have nearly 30,000 copies, this is why I have to tread lightly to explain this so people don't misunderstand, think we can't trust the Bible. We have nearly 30,000 copies that were written at different times in different places and spread all over the world. No one person, no group of individuals had the manuscripts in their possession to corrupt it the way they wanted. Because of that, God ensured that we would know what the originals were. Why? Because let's say your copy in Rome, written 300 AD. John, you have these corruptions, mistakes or intentional corruptions. But then we have 50 other copies written before yours and after, spread all over, all agree this is what this verse says, disagreeing with you. See, now we know, oh, okay, that's defective. See, this is how God has preserved it. Now, the only problem is modern scholarship likes to prioritize the earlier papyri and Codex Vaticanus, what's called Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, or Sinaiticus, as some would pronounce it, which is from the 4th century, 300 AD. Even though those copies will give you the same message, same gospel, same Jesus, as reflected in your English translations, pick up an NIV, which prioritizes these early copies, and compare it to your King James. Over 93% of the time, they agree. So I pick up John 1, it's going to read the same way. An NIV, it's going to read it. It's just over 90%, about 93% of the time to 98% of the time. Some have different statistics. They agree. So you're going to get the same. It's that either 2 to 7% difference. So with that said, with all that necessary qualification.
Sorry, Sam, but nothing changes the core doctrines of the faith, though.
No, it's a fact. It's just a fact. It's a factual statement. I'm not saying it's not a statement of faith. It's a statement of fact. That's why when you pick up NIV, the only difference is it's modern English, meaning that it's not Elizabethan English, thou and die, but you're going to get the same message, and pretty much over 90% of the time, they're translating the same verses. Pick it up, and I want people to prove me wrong. Pick up NIV, pick up King James, or pick up English Standard Version, New King James. There are those differences that even with those differences, you still don't get different theology. But however, the issue is, should we prioritize these earlier witnesses, or should we look into what's known as the majority text? The majority text, the reason why it's called majority text is because, let's say, because the numbering for the Greek copies of the New Testament varies. Some will say 5,300 plus, some say it's 5,900. Let's go with 5,300 plus. Over 5,000 form a majority where they have a very high degree of agreement over against these fewer earlier copies. So let's say 5,300. We say 5,000 of them are majority text. The 300 are the earlier copies from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. Now, these 5,000 have a much higher degree of agreement, and they form their own what they call textual line, the majority text, also known as the Byzantine text. The reason why scholars don't prioritize them is because these readings, the earliest of evidence that we have for them are, let's say, from the 400s onwards. Then they become the majority. So because they assert or assume that these readings, the evidence for them is not as early as these other manuscripts, therefore these other manuscripts should be prioritized. And I say baloney. Why? Just because you may have a stream that doesn't have as early support for it, you still have to account for the fact that these are copies of earlier copies. So if I have a copy in the 400s, that's not the original. That means it's based on something earlier. So that shows that these readings do go back as far as we can trace it, and therefore should be prioritized. So the majority should be prioritized for that reason. Second reason, the church, for the most part, until the discovery of the papyri, because these earlier copies were not discovered until the 1800s, 1900s. So that means up until that time, what the churches had access to were the majority text. These were the manuscripts that God preserved and gave the church access to, and these are the manuscripts they translated from. God is sovereign and he's real. We all agree. If he is real, and he is sovereign, and he loves his church, and he does, and he wants to make sure the church has access to the right set of manuscripts to translate from, if these earlier witnesses were superior, why then did he allow them to be buried? Why didn't he make sure these were the ones that the church had access to? Obviously, that means the majority text is what God was pleased with. If he's pleased with it, that means we need to prioritize those manuscripts and go with those. And when they disagree with the early ones are to be set aside. So that leads me to the third point. The translations today that are based on the majority text, the Byzantine text, the majority of our witnesses, are the King James Version, the New King James, and Modern English Version. So when you ask me, what do I prefer? Because I'm convinced the majority text is superior, from which we got what's called the Textus Receptus, the received text, which is a smaller number of Greek manuscripts that were collated, starting with Erasmus in the 16th century, which comes out of the majority of witnesses, from which then the King James was produced. I prioritize these translations, and I prefer the King James for one reason. One reason. And I'm not saying people should follow me. This is my journey, because for over 300 years, and even up to now, the King James Bible for over 300 years was the translation for all English-speaking Christians all over the world and had no competition. When did the King James started slowly disappearing from being that prominent? In the 20th century, from the 1950s onward, when a plethora of modern versions were produced, so that today, the two best-selling Bible translations, NIV and King James. King James is still a bestseller. Now, in some surveys, NIV sells better, but that's because NIV has more publishers and societies promoting it less than the King James does. So the King James doesn't have the publicity or the money spent to promote it, and it's still the best-selling Bible next to the NIV.
Wow.
So for me, I start with God. What do I mean? I start with God, who's almighty, he is, who is faithful and good, and he is, and who's sovereign. Because I start with that as a given, I must assume that God would not allow a translation to be the chief unparalleled translation for English-speaking Christians for over 300 years if he didn't approve of its readings. Right? I'm not an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I know God is real and he's faithful and he loves his church. And he wants the bride of Christ to have a sure word that they know this is the voice of our Lord, undiluted. Well, that was the King James, even up to now. Therefore, when modern scholars, textual critics tell me, there are defective readings in the King James that should be ignored, my question to them is, did God know they were defective? Yes. And does God want to make sure that his church do not quote readings that were not part of the original autographs that were later added? Yes. So then why did he make the King James the chief translation based on manuscripts that you claim have verses that were added later, whether accidentally or intentionally, that shouldn't be there? Where was God to protect his church? No, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. I can't accept that. And interestingly, the Orthodox Church's official Greek text is a Byzantine text, a majority text. They do not follow the earlier papyri. For them, it's a majority text. That's why when you go to an Orthodox church, don't take my word for this. In the pew, you'll either find the New King James Version or the King James Version. They don't use the NIV. Yeah. And the Orthodox Church doesn't use the Hebrew Old Testament. It uses the Greek versions called the Septuagint.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. I personally use the King James, the New King James, not because I don't want to use the King James, but I struggle a little bit. I struggle a little bit with the Elizabethan. So, but yeah.
Let me add a further caveat because you said that. If someone has a hard time understanding Elizabethan English, the Bible's to be understood and lived out. It's not just to be read, just like it's meant to be understood so you can know God and love him and obey him, because Jesus says, he who loves me keeps my word. If a translation is hard for you to understand, hard for you to read, then you won't know God truly. You won't know his will. You won't be able to act upon it. So if the New King James is difficult, because a lot of people even have a hard time with that, modern English version is difficult, then I would even advise for those people who are on a journey, start with the NIV. Start with the New, for now. Read it so you can understand it. Once you understand it and your comprehension of English language improves, then work your way up to Elizabethan English. But don't get hung up on you. No. I'd rather have you, like Paul said, I'd rather speak 5 words clearly than 10,000 words in a tongue that you don't understand.